So my next guest on the Storytelling Mastermind is Dr. Tanvi Gautam. And Tanvi is a multi-talented woman. She is a lecturer at Singapore Management University. She is a consultant. She is an award-winning keynote speaker, and she's a certified storytelling coach. And most importantly to me, a very good friend. Welcome to the Storytelling Mastermind, Tanvi. Thanks for your time.
You're most welcome, Andrew. I do consider being your friend on top of that list of accomplishments.
Wow, thank you. It's a very select list.
Yes.
But there's a story in there. No, I always want to introduce you as my friend because I think, when we interview people, you have a level of friendship and a history together, I think we can cut through what the superficial stuff and share some deep insight. And I think that's what people listening will really appreciate. Okay. So we're talking about storytelling, and I know this is very close to your heart. How long have stories been important to you?
Let's see. I think I started talking when I was about 2, so let's begin right there. I think I've been telling stories since I was 2. I started getting paid for it when I was about 25. So that's been the trajectory. It's one of those things that I lean into very naturally. And, I started realizing what was going on when at the university, term after term, the feedback from my students, whether it was my PhD students or my MBA students, it was always, her stories help us learn, and they're so captivating. And it wasn't just one student, it was almost, all of them. And I was like, maybe there is something here. And that's when I started leaning into bringing this more to my corporate clients as well.
Okay, excellent. And I think that's the key point to take away from there is no learning without a story, really.
Yeah. I would say that you can learn without a story. It's just that you'll forget it pretty soon. So if you want to learn and remember, that's when you need a story.
Well, yeah. I mean, we as human beings go back as far as we can, have always told stories as, this is where the food is, this is where the danger is, this is where shelter is. So I think that's, from an evolutionary perspective, that's why our brains are wired this way, right?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, that's what I tell my clients. I mean, you look at any ancient civilization, you look at China, look at India, look at Egypt, look at Ireland. At the heart of every ancient civilization are stories.
Right.
And they transmitted values through stories, and they transmitted ideas through stories. And those stories have survived some, hundreds and thousands of years without the need of any PowerPoints. Thank you very much.
Yes.
So that tells you something about the power of story to convey ideas and to last as long as ideas can with the help of stories.
So you teach storytelling to C-suite executives, senior leaders. I think I know the answer to this, but let me ask the question. Why do you think that leaders need to develop their storytelling if, as you said, many of us have been telling stories since we were 2 years old? Why do we need to learn about the art of telling stories?
That's a great question. You would think that storytelling, and this happens at all my workshops, by the way, everybody comes in really excited, storytelling workshop, because they think this is just fun and games and you swap stories. And it is, don't get me wrong, it is. But I think that there are certain subtleties that take a story to become a good story and a good story to become a great story. And so it is a bit of an art and it's a bit of a science. And the more you have some guidance on what are the nuances of practicing that art, or what are the principles of practicing the science, the more impactful you will be. Not all of us are born Michelangelo, even though all of us can paint a house with some clouds and the sun. So, how far do you want to go? How impactful do you want to be? And if you're wanting to create real impact, you do need to spend a little bit of time trying to understand the art and science and some very small but powerful tweaks you can make to create stories that land the way you want them to.
Okay. So you talk about both science and art. I think that's interesting, and we'll explore both of those sides. But here's the case. You've said we all can tell stories, but we don't all know the nuances. We're not all master storytellers. So what is it costing somebody if they're not an effective storyteller?
Oh goodness, they're wasting everybody's time. I mean, day after day, you see these leaders who will stand there and then, they think they're telling a story, which they're not, by the way. And they are wasting an opportunity to inspire their people, to connect with their people, to help them see the larger vision that, these CEOs want to be brought to life. And you might say, oh, so if it's just all about inspiration. No, it's not all about inspiration. I mean, I work with C-suite leaders to help them tell a better story of translating their vision. That's one part of it. But we use a lot of storytelling even with the sales and marketing teams, right? So the chief marketing officers and their teams, because at the end of the day, when you're going to market, you need to have a narrative that connects with where the client base is at. So I'll give you an example. One of the companies that I work with, we've been doing this APAC wide because one thing is to learn how to do storytelling, but the other is to be sensitive to the nuances of the market in which you're telling storytelling and doing storytelling. And Andrew, this, you work in Asia as well. There is no such thing as Asia. So the kind of stories that will land in China are not the kind of stories that will work in the India market, are not the same as the stories you would tell in Singapore. And so contextualizing it in a way that the market response can make a difference of a few $100,000 million at times in connecting with the client and how you're going to market. So there is the right brain aspect of it, which is the inspiration, the vision, the connection, the sense of belonging that we want people to feel. But there is a very tangible, what I would say, dollars and cents imperative to being able to tell good stories.
Okay. Good. Well, you've made the point beautifully. It's worth investing because it has a return on investment, right?
Oh, undoubtedly, undoubtedly. And here's the interesting thing, since this is a storytelling, mastermind, you should be telling lots of stories, even in our session. I remember I finished, a workshop, and I was on my way to the airport, and I kept getting these text messages from somebody who had been in the workshop. And this was the next morning, and they, oh, I need to talk to you. And I said, oh my God, this is like an over enthusiastic participant wanting to, clarify something or, what it was. So I was like, let me land back. I'll connect with you, etc. So I landed back, and I waited a whole day before I got in touch because I wasn't sure what the urgency was. And then I got in touch and I said, well, where's the fire? And he said, you won't believe what happened. I said, what happened? He's like, we finished the storytelling workshop at 6 o'clock in the evening. And at 8:30, I had a meeting with a client who we were facing an impasse for about more than a year because neither party was willing to budge on anything. And I decided to start using some of the principles you had taught us in the workshop. And we broke through, and not only did we, resolve the issue we had around the current contract, they've actually asked us to put in a bid for a second one. And Andrew, this is like the fastest turnaround that I have ever seen of a storytelling workshop. That, literally, what was it, like 2 hours later, you take something you've learned and you've applied it. The issue is not so much that there is a difficulty in application as much as people don't have the exposure to the right frameworks and principles, which they can then take and start using right away. I have never seen something that has such an immediate turnaround of sorts as storytelling.
Okay, absolutely. And so let me tell a quick story, and this is not to in any way, have a competition of stories, but yeah, you just reminded me in terms of fast turnaround. Somebody who we both know was whose name is Sean. It's irrelevant to the watchers, but Sean was in a taxi going to an interview, and he calls me, and he says, "I'm going for this interview for this job." And I said, "Well, that's great. Again, where's the fire? It's his fire. Why are you calling me?" He says, "Because they're going to ask me, a fee negotiation." And so I asked him, "What story are you telling yourself about your value. And so he told me that. And then I said, well, what is that the best story to tell about yourself? If there was a better story to tell, what would be the better story you could tell? He told me a better story. He told that better story in the interview, and he said it was worth $100,000 on the salary package. Right.
Yeah.
So, so in terms of the revenue capacity of the ability to either tell stories to yourself or tell stories to somebody else.
I think what you did was very much in line with the work that you do on self-leadership, right?
Yeah.
Because self-leadership is a lot about, how you lead yourself and what's the narrative in your head about yourself. And, that's what I kind of refer to as the personal myth almost, that carries you as you move through the world, the stories that you tell yourself that hold you back or propel you forward, which actually are even more important than the work I do with some of the people in the sales or marketing or the C-suite, because it's your inner story will always be in greater control than this outer story, and people don't understand that link. And the work that I also do with in women in leadership, and you're a part of that program as well, and I think we both help the participants understand this. So what's your inner dialogue? This whole series of inner dialogues that you have about yourself that are forming a story that then impacts how you move into the world, is very, very important. So I think when we talk about storytelling, I tell people, so somebody will come and say, well, what can I use storytelling for? I'm like, well, what can you not use storytelling for is a better question to ask, because I see its application, be it in interviews, like how you helped Sean. I see its application in negotiation, be that for your salary or for a contract. I see its application in moving people along in change and transformation projects. I see its application in one-on-one coaching. I see its application in your own ability to step into your powers. So honestly, Andrew, and I know you and I completely agree on this, I really don't know a more powerful tool than storytelling when it comes to having an impact on yourself.
We lost you a little bit on the connection there on that last piece. Can you just say that last piece again?
No, I was just saying that it is my favorite go-to tool, right? Yeah. I haven't seen any other tool that has such a wide range of application or such a quick level of impact. And so I am completely biased towards storytelling.
Very good, very good. And there's no problem with that on this interview. Okay, so let's dive into the nitty gritty. We both brought up this concept of personal myth. So before we tell stories to other people, we should become aware of the story we tell ourselves. Is that correct?
Yeah, absolutely.
So how do you go about, so if somebody's listening to this and go, I have no idea what my personal myth is, right? I have no awareness of my own personal story. How do you go about creating that awareness or getting people to know what their personal myth is?
Yeah, so I think it takes a little bit of effort. You have to kind of step back, and there are, activities and frameworks again that can help you undiscover what that personal myth is. But irrespective of what is the, activity that you undertake or reflection space that you enter, the common thread on discovering your personal myth is to be able to zoom out of the events in your life and look at it from a third-party perspective and see, are there any patterns? Is there anything that seems to be a red thread that kind of carries through in everything that you have done? And so, when I first did this exercise for myself, I kind of looked at my life and I was like, I looked at my resume. Actually, that's where I began, because this was like many, many years ago, and I wasn't a story coach then, and storytelling coaching was not that common at that point in time. And I kept noticing it said the first person from the university to go as an exchange student to Australia, the first woman from Asia to be invited to this North American think tank, the first. And I'm like, oh my God, there is like this, what's with this first and first and first. And I was I doing it consciously? I don't think so. But when I was seeing the trend, that was one of the red threads. I can't say it was the only red thread, but it was one of the red threads. And that made me kind of think about, where is this drive coming that I get so passionate about being the first mover? Not everybody is as passionate about being the first mover, but what is it about myself? And that's where, I suddenly had an aha about, a story that I used to hear from my grandmother, which I have shared with you. I don't know whether you want me to share it now or
Yeah,
not.
sure. Now, absolutely. Perfect timing.
Okay. So, I, as a kid, and I haven't told this story to many people. So it's like, I'm telling the story in public for the first time. So it's, it's a very personal story, but my grandmother used to tell me about this story of these two brothers who, this was hundreds of years ago, in ancient India, who wanted to cross the river in search of higher learning. And they were told at that point in time that, no, you can't cross the river. If you cross the river, you're excommunicated, you can't come back. And they kind of ignored it, and they went and they did what they had to. And after many years, they returned to the village, and they were like, oh, these guys are going to welcome us back and say, what a great quest you had, what we learned, come and teach us about it. But when they came back, they were stopped at the border, and they were like, no, you can't enter. You were warned. You are not supposed to come back. But they said, we have learned so much. We have so much to share with you. And they said, we're sorry, rules are the rules. And so these two brothers kind of walked away unapologetic, and they're like, you can keep your rules. Thank you very much. And they went and they set up their own two villages. And I'm the great-great-granddaughter of one of the brothers. And I was like, see, this is how my personal myth has been playing even without my realizing it. This need to, break away from the pack in search of something different, something better, something that will help raise the community to a different level. And not being afraid to set up as many villages as it takes. And so, in a lot of work that I do with my clients, it is about breaking away from the past. And it takes a ton of courage. It's not easy to just stand up and say, I'll be the first one. It looks very glamorous on a resume or on a profile. But what it takes backstage to be able to do that is not possible till you understand what's your personal myth and what's really driving you to what you see as you look back at your life and its history. But here's the important part of it, is that once you've identified that personal myth, it becomes so much easier to start designing your life and leaning into spaces that bring you fulfillment, that allow you to contribute your best. More you can contribute your best, the more other people are drawn to the energy of what you bring to the table, right? And so it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy of playing in places that energize you, being able to give more, being able to attract other people. It almost becomes like your personal brand. And I know you also do work on personal branding, and I think the personal myth feeds into your personal brand.
Oh, absolutely. And I love that story. I mean, it's pure Joseph Campbell, the mythologist, would love that story because it has all the elements of, the crossing of the river, the challenge or the going to the underworld and, all of these things. But there are, I love that story because there are two groups of people in this story. There are the villagers, the original villagers, and there are the two boys. And, in my work, I would ask somebody, who do you associate with? Are you the person that is terrified that you can't come back? Right. I left home at 18 years old and went to university in a different city. And then at 25, I left, my home country of England, never to return. And so, I've crossed oceans as well as rivers. So I know I don't associate with the villagers. And once you have the knowledge, of course, and this is why people don't want to step into leadership positions, or, that they're concerned that if they appear clever, that they will be ostracized by others. I see this in my own teenage children. One daughter, we're constantly encouraging her, hang out with the smartest kids in the class. Don't hang out with the lower end, because they will make it not okay to get good grades, because you're making them feel bad, right? So that story, anybody who has children, storytelling is a key component of instilling values and aspirations, hope, and code of conduct into your own children.
Oh, I absolutely agree. And I think what you're talking about, this ability to step away from the village, right? you and I, the circles we move in, what is everybody talking about nowadays? We're talking about digital transformation. We're talking about disruption. We're talking about, all these fancy terms that sound so great when people are talking about it. But does anybody understand what it really means to be disrupted? And what does it really take that when you are either disrupted from an outside force, which also I have been in my personal myth, my entire, again, in, being able to spot places where you got disrupted. And how did you respond to when you got disrupted? What was the story you told yourself when you got disrupted? Did you have the ability to create a new story when you got disrupted? Or, like you said, what's the courage and the guts it takes to step into saying, okay, fine, we will be the disruptors. And when somebody turns to you and says, well, no, that can't be done, or are you mad, or that's how it's always been done, just what are you thinking? And your response is, you know what, I'm going to go back into my shell, or we're going to give this project up. It's a story that you're telling yourself. So, romanticized as it is to talk about transformation and disruption, you need to work with the storylines that allow you to break away from the past and step into the new. And that's what, very often when I'm working with on culture change, is to be able to create that new world vision, which is so compelling that people are willing to do what it takes to move away from the past. But if you can't create that vision, don't expect anybody to come along.
Yeah.
Right? The stuff that HR people talk about, oh, we want engagement from our employees. I'm like, when was the last time you engaged them? It's a two-way street. You got to give engagement to get engagement. And I can't think of a better way than storytelling to create engagement.
Very good. So we've talked about the inner myth and our own personal journey. And you've talked a lot about frameworks and principles that if somebody's wanting to get better at a story, what might be a framework or some principles you could share with us today so the listeners can go, okay, I can start to apply that to tell a better story?
Yeah. So here's what I thought we would do, right? I actually made notes about this. So I wanted to talk about the top 5 mistakes of new storytellers, which is what I think a lot of people are as they try to embrace more of storytelling. And, I thought I will share what my top 5 are and what your views are on it as well, right?
Okay.
And we'll go 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, so that there is a big climax at the end about what is the number 1 mistake I think people make when they're doing storytelling, new to storytelling, right? So let's start with number 5. I think number 5 is that when people tell a story, their stakes are not high enough, right? Why should anybody care about your story if the risk factor is not high? And people tend to ignore that. They just come on and they tell a story, but does anybody, really care? Think about it when you go to watch a movie. The movies that you remember are the ones where you're at the edge of your seat, so to speak, right? But when was the last time when you were at the edge of your seat when you were hearing your CEO tell a story or a colleague tell a story? Probably not. And so, you want to have to get people to get involved in resolving the problem or the conflict that you're talking about in your story. So I think that's one of the mistakes. And number 5 for me. What's your take on that, about people telling stories where it's like sometimes I heard. So here's the thing. We were in a workshop and this guy, he was telling a story like he was teaching somebody to boil an egg, for goodness sake. I was like, can we raise the stakes a little bit here? No one wants to hear about how to boil an egg. So what's your take on that? Do you agree that that's a mistake?
I absolutely agree that people have to, people have to feel the level of tension, right?
Yeah.
They have to sort of step in and emotionally connect with, oh my God, how would I feel in that situation? And if people are just sharing the data points of history, there's no stepping into the story. Whereas the moment you say, there I was on the side of the mountain, wondering whether the person I love most in the world was going to last the next hour, right? And then suddenly everybody's like, well, how would I feel with that? And you and I were both judging the speech competition where just that story was missing level of emotion at that point. The person was saying, oh, the helicopter arrived and took my husband away. And was like, I imagine, terrified that this would be the last moment. And then in the distance, you hear the whir of the helicopter and see it coming over the horizon, that sense of relief. and then somebody's hooked into the story right there and then, correct?
Yeah. But I think you also did something else, Andrew, which is that, you kind of took us to the scene as it
Yeah.
was unfolding. It's such a
Yeah.
great skill of storytellers, is to be able to, transport people to where it's actually happening, right?
Mm.
So let's talk
So
about
with
number
number 5,
four.
we agree. Number 4?
Yeah. Number 4 is there's no clear why. Like, why are you telling a story? Right. So I tell people, you can't do this. At the end of the workshop, you go next day and you find some story to tell because, well, that woman in the storytelling workshop said stories engage or stories, create impact. So let me tell a story. And, people will always come and say, okay, where can I find the stories? That's a question I get very often. Where can I find the stories to tell, the ones that you said you should be telling the story? And I say, I don't care where to find the stories. You will find them, and then there are ways to figure out where to find the stories. But you have to have um, a clarity on what's the idea you're trying to convey through the story, right? Because as we were talking earlier, I mean, it's well known that messages become more sticky when they are wrapped in a story. So you can't be doing storytelling for the sake of storytelling. You really have to begin by asking, why am I telling this story? And what's the impact I want to create on the people? And that really needs to be the starting point. And I don't think people spend enough time thinking about, why am I telling the story? So what's your take on that?
Well, I couldn't agree more. Intentionality is everything, and even pre-framing the audience that it is, right? When I was a kid, we had a program on the TV. It was just before the news every night, and as young kids, we would go, and it was called Jack and Ori, and somebody, usually a sort of minor celebrity, would tell a story, and so there was the theme music, and then the storyteller was sitting in the chair, and there was kids at his or her feet, and he said, are you sitting comfortably? Then I shall begin. And so that cues you in that you're going to receive a story. When I'm coaching, I use personal stories to give people options and choices. I don't tell people this is what you should do or this is what I did. I would say, and I would always use a permission frame, and I would say, look, can I share a personal story to make a point? And then they go, yes. And then their mind is switched on. They're going to hear a story, and they're going to hear a story because it has a point. Otherwise, why is the coach talking when the coach should be listening? Right. So I always pre-frame that. And if I was, obviously on a platform as a speaker, they expect us to start with a story. So that's already pre-framed. But again, I would often say, let me share a personal story. And then that tells them that there's a reason why I'm doing it.
Yeah. Again, I think you're talking about something that's so important here, is the neurochemistry of storytelling, right?
Mm-hmm.
By using simple phrases like, can I tell you a personal story? Or I love that one where you said, are you sitting comfortably? Because I was suddenly like, yes, I'm sitting comfortably. What's the story? I think I might start using that, but are you sitting comfortably? I have to tell you a story. It just primes the mind to receive information better. And I mean, if you think about it, we're living in a attention deficit world. Something or the other is constantly hissing, beeping. Did you see that notification that flashed on my phone while we were talking right now? I hope it didn't show up on
No,
screen.
it doesn't show up on screen. Okay,
Right. But that's the lives we are living, right? Something is constantly popping up for attention, or pinging or beeping or hissing. If nothing else, you might say, I wonder, and Alexa very happily wants to know, help you with what it is that you're wondering with. So, we live in an attention deficit disorder world, and there is a neurobiology to storytelling that allows people to take a breath and suddenly tune into, well, what is it that she or he is just about to say? And it is an attention economy. The only way you will impact your people or your market is if you have their attention. So the question is, do you have their attention? And if you don't, do you know how to? And then storytelling helps you do that, right? All right. So
Number three.
Number three. Number three is, you think you have a story, but actually you don't.
Okay.
You think you have a story, but actually you don't. And I think the best example of this is all the money that companies are throwing behind creating corporate videos, white papers, case studies, where they think they're telling a story. But if you just go back and look at the number of views their videos have had, or the number of downloads, or who was the last person who actually read that case study that they spent thousands of hours writing, the numbers speak for themselves. So they think they're doing storytelling, but actually they're not. And this is where your question that you asked me right at the start comes right back in, as to what goes into making a good story, right? And one of the things, for example, we talked about was, are your stakes high enough or not? But another one that I would add here is the element of emotions in storytelling, right? Most of what the corporate leaders and marketing communication salespeople think is stories is actually a very left brain sanitized, templatized approach to conveying information. It is not storytelling. And to find out what is storytelling, you actually have to attend a workshop or a session to say, that is a storytelling, that's not a story. It's an attempt at a story, but it is not a story. And here's a very simple Tanvi's test I tell people to use to know whether you're telling a story or not. It's a very simple test. The test is this: if you stop telling your story, would somebody break down the door to find out what happened next? And if they will not, they're not telling a story. So when was the last time you picked up a corporate case study and felt, I'm going to break the door down because I need to know what happened next? Absolutely never, right? So yeah, so that's my number 3. You think you have a story, but actually you don't. What's your take on that, Andrew?
Oh, well, again, I totally agree. I did a LinkedIn post a few days ago about the fact that people are not logical; they're psychological.
And I love that one.
Yeah, but somebody wrote, why do you think it is that people try and leave emotion out at the workplace? And I said, and my response was, I think it's a very Anglo-Saxon frame, that this frame of professionalism, that I leave my emotional self at home and I'm totally professional at work. And that's total BS, because you cannot leave your psychological health or interest or your neurochemistry at the door of the office. It comes with you. And so stories, I think, is a acceptable professional way to convey emotion without somebody, oversharing, as the Brits would be terrified of somebody oversharing in a workplace, right? So I think people have trained to think that they can convey information in spreadsheets and data points, and whilst it may give you the data, as we said earlier, it's not memorable. And I remember doing a little bit of presentation coaching for a managing director of a shipping company who was going around the region on a town hall, talking about their need for improving some of their systems. And he had all these spreadsheets, and I said, well, what's it costing the company for this inefficiency? And he said, oh, this amount of money. And I said, well, that sounds like a lot of money, but as a shipping company, what could you buy with that? And he lit up immediately. He said, we could go out and buy a super tanker for cash. I said, well, that's the beginning of your story, right? Imagine going and buying a super tanker.
Yes.
How many bags of cash do you need to go buy a super tanker? Visualize that and go, we're throwing that in the ocean because of our inefficiency in our system. And then he had a story.
Yes, that's just such a beautiful illustration on how you could take the simplest data point and still embed it and wrap it in a story. And it doesn't take that much. Like I said at the start, it's the simplest of tweaks that can completely catapult the conversation into something else. And so this is interesting that you brought up this bit about data, right? Because I hear this from people a lot. It's like, in the world of big data, you want me to do storytelling? And I'm like, yes, in the world of big data, I do want you to do storytelling. I'm no stranger to analytics. I understand. I've God knows, I think that I had a slightly overcomplicated approach to my own data analysis when I did my PhD. So much so that I actually went to Chicago booths and learned from the professors who were in the process of developing that technique. So nobody needs to teach me about advanced statistics and analytical skills. I get that conversation more than people realize. But I tell people, I said, data is good, but data wrapped in story is even better.
Sure.
Right? So I'm not asking you to give up your data. I'm asking you to visualize them as bags of cash you're throwing them in an ocean.
Yeah.
And suddenly, it's so much more compelling. So, all the people who are listening who can't get enough of their data, it's if you're great at data, that's good. But database storytelling can completely change the game, as Andrew was mentioning. All right, so I'm being mindful of time. Mistake number 2 is that there are too many messages in your story. I see this in new storytellers all the time, is that when they start telling a story, they are trying to do too much within one single story, right? They want to solve world hunger and climate change and pollution and everything else all at the same time. And going back to what we were talking about, the neurobiology of storytelling, I mean, most people can't hold too many messages. And as storytellers often say, it's a simple rule of 3, right? What are the 3 key points you want to make? But if you are not clear about the message you really want to drive home, you stand at the risk of meandering all over the place. So yeah, you have elements of good storytelling. There's the visualization, there is the emotion, there is the stakes are high and all of that. But you're trying to do too much in one single story, as though it was the last story that you would ever tell. By the way, that's a great activity I do with some of my clients. If you could stand here and tell the last story like that you could ever tell, what would be that story? And that's another very powerful way of connecting to your sense of self and your personal myth and your contribution and where you want to go. Is it's like Randy Pausch's The Last Lecture, right? You probably have seen that on YouTube.
And it's Stephen Covey. What do you want written in your eulogy, right? But I love I love that question. What's the last story? Because I've not done that. That just gave me goosebumps. And so I'm going to be spending the rest of the day thinking, because I've told so many stories and do tell so many stories, what would be the last story I'd want to tell? Oh, you got me there, right there. That's it. So
well, that's why we are friends, Andrew, because you and I keep pushing each other to think different and bigger. That's part of it, right? Okay. All right. So that brings us to the final number 1 mistake, and my facial expression should tell you about how irritated I am about this altogether. 2 common mistake, which I see. I get on a soapbox about this because I see leaders doing this. I see sales and marketing teams doing this. I see ad agencies who, by the way, you would think should know storytelling better than most of us. I see them doing this a lot of the time. So the number 1 mistake of new storytellers, drum roll please, is that it is all about you, the storyteller. I, me, myself. Okay? Nobody cares. It's like all those, LinkedIn and Facebook updates where people can't stop talking about how cool they are and where they went and what they did and what they ate. And after a while, I completely unsubscribe from some of these posts. But, what people don't understand is neither you nor your product is the hero of the story. It is the audience that is the hero of the story, and they must feel as such. They must be able to identify with the story that you're telling. If I came to you just now and said, okay, Andrew, I have this big problem. I wonder if you can help me solve it. It's my anniversary next month, and I'm wondering whether I should take my husband for a weekend to Paris or I should take him for a weekend to New York. And there are people sitting in the audience who are like in their first role in the first year, and they're thinking like, how much are we paying for this workshop? Because it's like, what sort of a lifestyle does this woman lead? Because we can't connect with it at all. So it's a story about me and how cool I am and how much I do. but the audience is sitting there going, what the heck? I don't much really care about what's going on, right? And so, our first tendency is to use our stories, which, by the way, are really powerful. Like you said, can I tell you a personal story? But if you're not able to connect it back to the world of your audience and help them see why it matters to them, and that's what most people forget to do. That's what most people make the mistake of, is they don't close that loop, then it doesn't have the impact, right? So the number one mistake, I think, is forgetting that the story is not about you. You are telling a story to somebody else. Walk in the shoes of your listener.
Mm-hmm. And if your story is relevant, they will then be in your shoes, right?
Yes.
Right.
Yes, that's what it is.
Yeah, because then there's that the transformation then, or transference then happens, because they go, oh, I've had that dilemma too. Now, I've never had the dilemma of whether to take my spouse to Paris or New York. Although I have taken my spouse to New York, not Paris. It's ridiculous thinking about where they are. And it's so funny. I mean, I'm writing a speech, obviously, right now for a conference we both are speakers at, which is the Asia Professional Speakers Conference, which is happening in May in Singapore. And my very first story is about my very, very first speech that I got paid for. Now, although that's about me, everybody in that room is going to remember either their very first paid speech and or trying to get their very first paid speech. And so, A, the difficulty in getting the speech, and B, how I felt at that moment, of seeing the room filling up with people. It's like, peeking behind the curtain when you're a school play and going, there's people out there and I have to act. I thought this was a really good idea until about now.
That's right. We've all been there about something or the other.
Yeah, exactly. And so whilst the story is about me, it's about them, because the only reason I'm telling it is because it's relevant to them. And I've never told this story to an audience before. So it's always fun when you tell it the first time, as you say.
Yes.
Okay.
And I'm sure that you will. It happens to me, and I'm sure it happens to you. Is that the story, when you tell it to an audience, itself can sometimes evolve, because I've had scenarios where I've told a story with a particular slant, and somebody from the audience has come back, and this happened with my TEDx talk, which was a very personal story that I had shared, and I was going in one direction with one message for the longest time, and then one of the viewers, actually somebody in South Africa who I have not met, wrote in after seeing that TEDx talk, and she said, this is the message you were giving, but actually here's a takeaway you didn't think about. And I said, isn't it beautiful? The fact that she could listen to the exact same story and see it from a wider lens than I have. And I think that the reason I'm sharing that is that I think that's the beauty of stories, is that they allow you to co-create meaning. And the transformation is not just for the listener, but also very often for the teller. And that is just fascinating for me.
Yeah, well, that's beautiful. And so it was your TED talk was brief and light touch. Is that?
No, it was the talk. The brief and light touch was, I wanted to let you know, let's not talk so much about it, that because it's a conversation in its own right, on how you use storytelling to convey ideas, and the TEDx environment is so time limited. I think like they give you 12 minutes or something like that, right? And so to be able to use storytelling in such a time limited environment takes a lot of effort. The talk itself is about the illusion of inclusion, on how we think, what we think makes us feel included versus what actually inclusion is all about. And there's so much work happening nowadays on inclusive leadership, and what does inclusion really mean? I mean, just because I've invited you to the boardroom and you are one of the only woman board member, is that really inclusion? Or is it something else? And what's the story in your head as you're sitting there trying to speak up? And what's the story in their head as they see you walk into the room? All of which need to be addressed as you try and create a relationship, and as you try to create an impact in the role that you are in, right?
Beautiful. Well, we have covered your 5 things not to do, and at the same time have worked out 5 things to do. All right, which
Yeah.
and so um, as people go through that, I really appreciate you sharing so openly and sharing your own personal myth of crossing the river, finding the knowledge, and starting new villages, which I know you have done. So thank you very much for your time, Dr. Tanvi Gautam, and enjoy very much the rest of your day and go write some new stories.
I will. Thank you so much for having me, Andrew.
No, it's my pleasure. Ciao for now.